David Davis.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I am not in the habit of issuing trigger warnings, but I must warn the House in this case that this speech covers deeply distressing events. I will discuss infant deaths, failures in care and allegations of a grave miscarriage of justice. Lucy Letby was convicted of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder 7 more. She received multiple concurrent full life sentences. The case horrified the nation. It seemed clear. A nurse had turned into a serial killer. Now, I initially accepted the tabloid characterisation of Letby as an evil monster. But then I was approached by many experts, leading statisticians, neonatal specialists, forensic scientists, legal experts, and those who had served at Chester Hospital who were afraid to come forward. The experts included a past president of the Royal Statistical Society, a past president of the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health, people who were more knowledgeable than the purported experts whose evidence convicted Letby. They were all concerned by what they perceived as false analyses and diagnoses used to persuade a lay jury to convict Letby. Now, sadly, none of us are strangers to miscarriages of justice. There have been simply too many. The Birmingham 6, the Guildford 4, the Stockwell 6, all the famous ones. But Exeter University Miscarriage Database lists nearly 500 people wrongfully imprisoned. And astonishingly, wrong forensic evidence is responsible for 81 cases, and which led in those cases to over 500 years of unjust imprisonment. And many of those cases involved caregivers convicted by medical experts' testimony asserting deliberate harm where causes of death were in fact natural. These people were all exonerated after those who doubted their guilt were initially met with the same fierce public pushback, now facing those who question Letby's guilt. So, what has happened here? The Countess of Chester Hospital neonatal unit suffered a sharp increase in deaths from a typical 2 to 4 a year to 17 in one 13-month period. When the hospital senior management became aware of the elevated mortality in June 2016, it was alarmed and commissioned some investigations, the most notable being carried out in November 2016 by the Royal College of Paediatrics and Child Health. Their report noted many failings on the unit, all of which, at least in part, if not in total, could have been the cause of these deaths. The report highlighted inadequate staffing levels, delayed escalation of concerns to tertiary units, and, I quote, disconnect between the neonatal leadership and the trust's governance and risk management processes. In essence, because of a mixture of inadequate resources and poor medical management, the hospital was not capable of keeping these very fragile babies alive. A fact recognised, actually, by the hospital when the neonatal unit was downgraded in July 2016 and stopped taking babies of less than 32 weeks gestation. The report, offering a completely different reasons for the deaths, was never shown to the jury. Some consultants in this case, in the course of this, had attempted to blame Letby for these deaths, and a redacted section of the report states, and I quote, "The consultants explained their allegations were based on Nurse Letby being on shift on each occasion an infant died, although not necessarily caring for the infant, combined with, quotes, gut feeling, close quotes. There's no other evidence or history to link Nurse Letby to the deaths, and her colleagues have expressed no concerns about her practice." No, I won't. I'm afraid I'm short on time. I've only got one intervention. That's the rule. Again, this section was never shown to the jury. These consultants then persuaded the management to call the police in April 2017. There was no hard evidence against Letby. Nobody saw her do anything untoward. The doctor's gut feeling was based on a coincidence she was on shift for a number of deaths. And this is important, although far from all of them. Far from all of them. It was built on a poor understanding of probabilities that was to translate later into an influential but spectacularly flawed piece of evidence. Around this time, the hospital was struggling with another problem, possibly a more sensible explanation for this sudden increase in deaths. Leaked reports showed the hospital, specifically the neonatal unit, battled a Pseudomonas aeruginosa infection for months. This antibiotic-resistant bug posed a serious risk to babies. The mortality rate for Pseudomonas ranges from 14.5% to 50% in children, and over 55% for cases involving extremely low birth weight infants like these. It's hard to see how we eliminate this as a cause of death or collapse for at least some of these babies. Again, the jury never knew about this contamination. Now, from the start of the case, Cheshire Police picked up on the doctor's statistical argument supposedly pointing to Letby. In April 2018, an officer on the investigation approached a leading statistician, Professor Jane Hutton, and asked her to put a figure on the likelihood of a nurse being on duty, quotes, during all the deaths and collapses, close quotes, in the unit. Of course, this is a false proposition, as Letby was not on duty for anything like all the deaths, as we'll see later. But that was glossed over at the trial. That notwithstanding, Professor Hutton informed the police that any proper statistical inquiry should not concentrate on one member from the outset. Instead, it required full, proper research into all possible explanations for any increase in babies collapsing, including their medical conditions and prematurity, as well as the broader performance of the unit. You'd think that would be common sense, really. Cheshire Police then signed a consultancy agreement with Professor Hutton. But then, in 2021, after Letby had been charged, the police wrote an email to Professor Hutton, and I quote it in terms: "We have had a further meeting this afternoon where we have informed the prosecutors we were looking into the validity of the statistical evidence in this case. The prosecutor has instructed us not to pursue this avenue any further at present." Now, this appears to be in direct contravention of the Code for Crown Prosecutors, specifically Part 3.3 of the Code. Prosecutors cannot direct the police or any other investigators. Again, the jury was never informed of Professor Hutton's explicit advice to the police that their statistical approach was flawed. Now, this matters enormously, because the most powerfully influential piece of evidence in the case was the prosecution KC showing a table with Letby listed as the only nurse on duty for all of the alleged murders and inflicted injuries. Professor Hutton, who has reviewed the case extensively, believes that deeply flawed statistical evidence was used, and she has said that statistical errors are, and I quote, "similar to those in the Sally Clark case, but worse." Sally Clark was convicted and acquitted of the murder of her two sons based on flawed statistical evidence. In May 2017, Dowie Evans, a retired doctor who runs a business which provides highly paid medical expert evidence in court cases, approached the National Crime Agency to volunteer his services. Evans' opinion that Letby injected air either into the baby's veins, causing air embolism, or down the nasogastric tube into the stomach, stopping the baby's breathing, was one of the foundations, indeed probably the major foundation, of the prosecution case. This supposed evidence is hugely controversial. 3 months into the murder trial, Letby's defence team applied for evidence from Dowie Evans to be excluded due to an adverse judgment from a judge in a previous case, who said a report by Dr. Evans was, quotes, "worthless and makes no effort to provide a balanced opinion," close quotes. In an extraordinary and, as far as I can see, unprecedented intervention, that very judge, Lord Justice Jackson, actually wrote to the trial judge with his judgment on Dr. Evans attached, clearly indicating how unsuitable Evans was as an expert witness. Evans' assertion of murder by air embolism was entirely based upon a research paper from 1989, and its relevance in these cases have been robustly challenged by the actual author of that paper. Evans changed his opinion on several key issues during the trial. He's now accused by Letby's lawyer of changing his opinion again since the end of the appeal process. Now, Evans disputes this, but if you're interested, I suggest you compare Evans' evidence recorded in the trial transcript of November the 1st, 2022, with his signed statement to Channel 5 on the 3rd of August 2024, and decide for yourself. It's also the case that Evans has submitted a report to the police. What is extraordinary, however, is that the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, has refused to provide a copy of that report to Letby's current defence counsel. Extraordinary. Questions have also been raised about the second expert witness of prosecution, Dr. Sandy Bowen. 8 families are currently filing formal complaints against her over their children's care, which are being considered by the General Medical Council. Which brings us to the actual cases and causes of the deaths. 2 expert neonatologists, consultant working neonatologists, are working through the cases to establish the actual causes of the baby's deterioration and deaths. They're doing so thoroughly, so this is taking time. So far, they have completed 2 detailed case reviews, baby O and C. There are 5 more which will be completed in the near future. Now, in the case of baby O, the prosecution claimed the baby was attacked with blunt trauma to the liver and had air injected into the nasogastric tube. The case notes tell a different story, showing how the doctors used excessive ventilation pressure during resuscitation, which overinflated the baby's lungs and prevented blood from flowing back to the lungs. This caused the baby to desaturate its blood oxygen level repeatedly. The medical team responded by increasing the pressures even more, initiating a downward spiral in the baby's condition. The overinflation of the baby's lungs forced the diaphragm downwards, pushing the liver into the baby's abdominal cavity. The consultant in charge took a decision to insert a needle into the abdomen to release what they thought was pressure in the abdomen, gas pressure in the abdomen. However, this was wrongly inserted into the right side of the baby's abdomen. As a result of this error, the needle penetrated the liver, causing serious internal bleeding. This was undoubtedly a significant contributory factor in the baby's death, if not the outright cause. The report states, and I quote, "The deterioration was predictable and his death was avoidable and resulted from suboptimal care." Suboptimal care. The author of that suboptimal care, the doctor who inserted the needle into the liver, was one of the principal accusers of Lucy Letby in the trial. This directly contradicts the prosecution's portrayal of events. The trauma to the liver was caused by a serious error by one of the consultants who led the accusations against Letby. The experts also stated there was no air in the gut in excess of what would be expected for a baby in these circumstances. None of this was made clear to the jury either. Prosecution's evidence was again predicated on Dowie Evans' diagnosis, which in this specific case alone changed multiple times. In the case of baby C, the prosecution claimed this was a healthy baby, killed by air being injected into its stomach. The case notes on baby C demonstrate this baby was actually profoundly unwell before birth. The baby suffered from severe fetal growth restriction. This meant the baby had to be delivered by caesarean section at an extraordinarily low birth weight, even for that gestation, 800 grams, about 1 3/4 pounds. Within an hour of birth, he developed respiratory distress. To treat the respiratory problems, they tried to deliver surfactant, a mixture that helps baby's lungs expand better, open up, down an endotracheal tube. The case notes, however, show that the doctor pushed the tube too far in, pushing it into one lung, meaning the other lung was left collapsed. In the days after the baby's birth, he showed several signs of abdominal obstruction, including the vomiting of bile, and he never opened his bowels since birth, which the doctor in charge did not recognise or diagnose. The report concludes by stating this baby died of natural causes compounded by suboptimal medical care. This again directly contradicts the prosecution's narrative of deliberate harm. Dowie Evans' diagnosis claimed the baby had air injected in the stomach, so he could no longer breathe. This was predicated on an X-ray showing an unusual amount of air in the stomach. It's become clear that Letby was not even at the hospital when the X-ray was taken, nor has she been at any point till then since the baby C's birth 2 days earlier. So whilst the baby died from natural causes, there is evidence of suboptimal care, including the administration of surfactant and I quote, the lack of recognition and appropriate management of signs of abdominal obstruction. Again, the doctor responsible for these errors was another one of those who made accusations against Lucy Letby. And again, none of this was made clear to the jury. There is a great deal of evidence demonstrating that there are much more likely alternative causes of these tragic deaths than those put up by the prosecuting team. The most likely is that the hospital neonatal unit was not up to caring for these fragile children, either in resource or skill terms. And this shortcoming might have been compounded by other factors such as the Pseudomonas infection.
Will my honourable friend give way?
I give way.
I'm very grateful to him for giving way. He'll be aware that there's a family connection with my constituency of Hereford and South Herefordshire. What he says is deeply troubling and distressing on so many different levels. I would just like to ask him whether his conclusion is that there is some case in justice to consider this an unsafe verdict.
There is case in justice, in my view, for a retrial, but there is a, I would say, a technical problem. There is a problem. One of the problems we face is that much of the evidence was available at the time. I mean, what I have described is an expert analysis of the case notes which were there at the time. But it was simply not presented to the jury. This means the Court of Appeal can dismiss it, basically saying the defence should have presented it at the initial trial. It is in essence saying, if your defence team weren't good enough to present this evidence, hard luck, you stay banged up for life. Now, that may be judicially convenient, but it's not justice. This has been a historic problem in Britain, delaying the resolution of a number of miscarriage of justice cases. Secondly, of course, the so-called expert evidence in this case largely amounted to putting together theories suiting the prosecution case, from the bogus statistical arguments through to the wrong diagnoses I've just detailed. Again, this problem is not new. In 2011, the Law Commission made a number of recommendations on precisely the handling of expert evidence. There's even a section in it entitled Inferring Murder from Unexplained Infant Deaths. These recommendations have not made it into law nearly 15 years later. It's past time this was put right. So perhaps most worrying of all in this case, is it's just the latest example, more than a decade after the mid-staff scandal, of the National Health Service's inability to analyse its own failings. This matters because until we do learn these lessons, there will continue to be unnecessary deaths in hospitals up and down the country. But my central argument today, which comes back to what the Right Honourable Gentleman asked me, is what to do about a trial which, in my view, is a clear miscarriage of justice by a judicial system that could not manage admittedly difficult statistical and medical scientific evidence. The only body available to correct this today is the Criminal Cases Review Commission. In my view, it should look at all the new diagnoses when they come out and, if necessary, consult leading neonatal and statistical authorities in the land. The most expert people who are much more equipped to give proper assessment than the experts who were employed by the police at the time. And so as a result, it should order, in my view, a retrial, and it should do it quickly. Now, this is significant because the CCRC has recently been criticised, members may have read about it, in the Andrew Malkinson case, where there was a 17-year delay, effectively, from releasing him from prison because DNA evidence proving him innocent of the rape case he was convicted of was known a few years, 4 years, I think, after his conviction, and yet it took a further 13 years to correct it. That can't happen again. That can't happen again. We cannot repeat that. If, as I believe it will, a retrial clears Lucy Letby, she should be released in her 30s, not in her 50s. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.